Today, as opposed to yesterday, we were tightly focused on Junipero Serra. Today, we want to broaden our focus a little bit and talk about indigenous and Spanish and Mexican California, the whole time frame that constitutes a lot of what you are going to be talking to visitors and students about. This picture is the picture that is on the front of our book about Junipero Serra. It was painted by Louis Trory, a French artist who came to California with a Russian expedition in the 18 teens. And the reason we like this picture is because it makes a couple of really, really important points. The reason actually the University of Oklahoma Press liked this picture is that the priests appear on the spine of the book. And the native peoples are just on the front. So you have the native peoples and the cross. These are a group of Indians that Chori painted in front of Mission Dolores in San Francisco. And if any of you have been to San Francisco, the mission is still there. It does look like this. This is actually Dolores Street, and this is 16th Street right here. So it's still there. What these people are doing, they came down from Petaluma. They have agreed to affiliate themselves with Mission San Rafael, which are just going to be started. But what they're doing here, they're doing a kind of a ceremonial dance, and probably what they are doing, Randy Millikan, the great anthropologist who studied the native peoples of Northern California, thinks that what they're doing here, they are used in the ceremonial dance. They are purifying the mission grounds before they enter the mission system. So they're basically taking the mission and moving it into their own set of beliefs, their own set of theology, their own set of folkways. They're purifying it so that it can become their space. And the reason we like this picture is that it reminds us that, even though the archives that we study, the experiences that we study, the written record that we study is all Spanish. If it is studied creatively and intuitively, what we can get from these archives and from these records is the indigenous voice. And the indigenous voice is really crucial to this whole thing, because the overwhelming number of people in California during the entire time frame that we're going to be talking to you about were indigenous people. The proportion of indigenous to Spanish, probably not too distant from the proportion of hundreds of indigenous people to 2 Spanish people that are in this picture. So we think this picture does a good job not only of saying that indigenous people outnumbered Spanish people and Mexican people, but that they had an agency that is in the records but has to be kind of teased out of the records sometimes, but it is very definitely there. So with that as background, we're going to be talking about first the development of the mission system.
You're probably looking at this photo and thinking, who is this guy? Why are you showing us this image? Juan Maria de Salvatierra, S.J., Jesuit. Well, how many people come to this mission and think that the first missions that were founded in this part of the world were in Alta California? It's as if Father Serra was like a Harry Potter and he just arrived in San Diego. Many people don't know that the first missions were established in Baja California. Some of you, like the Heismans, went down with us to commemorate the founding of the first mission. Well, the first mission in Las Californias was founded by a Jesuit, and there was not a Franciscan with him. The other Jesuit with him was Francisco Maria Piccolo. They arrived in Baja California in October 1697, and they founded Mission Nuestra Señora de Loreto Concho, Madre y Cabeza de las Californias. So you've got the mother and head of the Californias. She was the one. as they embarked on their project of missionization and evangelization, the Jesuit missionaries were in a constant battle with the harsh environment of the Baja California Peninsula. They also had to contend with the wariness and the fierce resistance on the part of the indigenous people. However, from 1697 to 1767, the Jesuits founded 18 missions, and the last one was Mission Santa Maria de los Angeles Cabuhacamung.
See, what had happened was that the Jesuits had landed, it started in Loreto. They came across from Sinaloa. Father Eusebio Kino, the great Jesuit explorer, had landed in the 1580s, but the 1680s, but the first mission was founded in Loreto. They founded them down here, and then they began to move the mission frontier farther and farther north, so that by 1767, they're up here at Santa Maria, which is about 700 or 800 miles south of San Diego. So they have been pushing the mission frontier farther and farther north.
I'm going to take you on a little pictorial tour of some of these missions. So here, those of you who were with us last night, you saw this image already of Nuestra Señora de Loreto Concho. And then here we have a 1947 image of it and a 1950. How many of you have been to Loreto? So a few of you have. So you've seen the reconstructed mission that has the museum next to it. Then we have San Francisco Javier de Vihebia Undo, and these images were taken by Harry Crosby. Some of you may know Harry. He lives in La Jolla. Harry Crosby is an amazing man. He is the man who knows everything about Baja California. Now, this mission is 23 miles away from Loreto, but it's a 2-hour drive on a twisting road, those of you who have been there, and that road is a bit bumpy. This mission still serves the local village and surrounding community whenever a priest is available to celebrate Mass. And as I mentioned, Harry Crosby, photographer and former high school chemistry teacher, but he fell in love with all things Baja California, and he photographed all of the missions and also the many beautiful cave paintings that are down there in the peninsula. His book, entitled Antigua California, is the go-to book on the history of Baja or Antigua California through the Jesuit period. Ours is the go-to book on Sarah. Another of his books, entitled California Portraits, it's part of our series. It's a very intimate look, or a portrait, of the lives of the people of Baja California during the 20th century, and I recommend it to you. It's wonderful. So here we have San Jose de Comondú, and we have the dates that the missions were founded. You saw this one last evening, La Purísima Concepción. What's left of Guadalupe? Not much. And here we have Mission San Ignacio. Father Luyando was the priest who was stationed there, and he planted 500 grapevines at this mission. In 1733, during Luyando's final year at Mission San Ignacio, his grapevines produced the mission's first vintage. Here we have Mission Santa Gertrudis. This was photographed by Ed Vernon, another person who loved the missions. Ed crisscrossed the whole Baja California Peninsula and the surrounding terrain. And he has a book, it's called Las Misiones Antiguas, the Spanish missions of Baja California. He has over 300 photos in that book, and what's really neat about this book, and you might be interested in computerized reconstructions of the earlier buildings, so it's very cool from an engineering standpoint. Here we have San Francisco Borja as photographed in 1956 by historian and Franciscan Father Maynard Geiger. And here we have Santa Maria de los Angeles. This was the last of the missions founded by the Jesuits.
The Jesuits were, as you probably know, a very powerful religious order. They had been founded in Spain in the 1500s by Ignatius Loyola. They were actually a little bit late to the mission enterprise. The Franciscans and the Augustinians and the Dominicans were there first in New Spain. So when the Jesuits get into the mission enterprise in the New World. When the Jesuits get into the mission enterprise, they basically are working in the northern frontier. So Father Kino, for example, worked in Sonora and Arizona. They worked in Chihuahua. They worked in Sinaloa. They worked in the northwestern part. And they started the missions in Baja California at the end of the 1600s. They're a very powerful group, and in the 1700s, the Bourbon monarchs of France and of Spain begin to resent the Jesuits very much. They especially resented the Jesuits' hold on the educational systems in their country. The best schools in France and in Spain were often run by the Jesuits. And the Bourbon monarchs, who were interested in increasing the power of the state against the power of the church, thought that in their schools the Jesuits were teaching people that, loyalty to the king was nice, but loyalty to the Pope was nicer. And they didn't like that very much. And so what happens is that in the 1760s, the Bourbon monarchs take steps against the Jesuits. And in 1767, the Bourbon monarch of Spain, King Charles III, Carlos III, expels the Jesuits from Spain and from the Spanish Empire. Portugal does the same thing. France does the same thing. And in 1773, the Pope himself suppresses the Jesuits completely. So the Jesuits don't exist formally for 50 years. So there are all of these Jesuit missions, especially in the northern part of New Spain, that need to be taken care of. And so what happens is that the crown appoints, for the first time, a governor of Baja California, Gaspar de Portola. Portola arrives in Baja California, gathers up all of the Jesuits in Baja California, 16 of them, brings them all to Loreto, and reads them, in their presence, reads to them the decree of expulsion, puts them on a boat, and sends them off.
But I've got to tell them about stuff that they took.
Go ahead.
Okay. So they didn't leave everything behind, these Jesuits. In addition to reports and letters that the Jesuits compiled during their time in Baja California, we also have a pictorial record of the Jesuit experience on the peninsula. I'm sure some of you have heard of Father Ignacio Tirsch. Well, he was a native of Bohemia. He was born in 1733. He was a Jesuit missionary at San Jose del Cabo from 1762 to 1768. And he produced at least 46 watercolors and drawings showing the local flora and fauna, as well as native life, Spanish soldiers, and cultural activities during the time of his residence.
And we're very lucky that when Tirsch left Baja California, when Portola ordered him out, he was able to gather up these paintings and take them with him.
Thank God. The watercolor paintings were most likely based upon direct observation. And Tirsch assigned his own captions to every painting. The captions were in German. And then thankfully, they've been translated to Spanish and then to English. When the Jesuits were expelled, as Bob explained to you, Tirsch returned to Prague in 1769 with these paintings. And now they are housed at the National Library of the Czech Republic. And you can access them online. So if you wanted to put together something to show the children about what life was like in Baja California, you can do that. Now, even though Tirsch's descriptions are limited in scientific detail and they're not the work of a trained illustrator, they're extremely important because they are faithful representations of his firsthand observations. So I'm going to take you through a quick little tour. As you can see, they really speak for themselves. Okay.
This may be, some people think that this may be based upon Fernando de Rivera y Moncada, who became a governor of California, of Alta California in the 1770s, but was the head soldier in Baja California.
And here the kind of fashion of those who came from Spain and now live in America. So kind of remember these faces. Color and style of the dresses of California Indians, and now here's my little composite. Hello, they look the same people with the different outfits.
So we don't know how much detail Tersch was actually interested in. He was more interested in the clothing, I think.
Right. So here you mentioned
So
about
there's
Portola.
Portola. This picture, Portola is from Lerida in Spain, and this picture was actually in the city hall of Lerida, where he was from. Portola had been sent from Spain, and he was engaged in fighting the Indians in Sonora. That's what he was doing. And when the Jesuits are expelled, the viceroy appoints Portola, the governor of California, to go over to Baja California and administer the expulsion of the Jesuits. And he does. Actually, when the Jesuits were expelled from a number of places in New Spain, from Sonora and Sinaloa, they were not treated well by the military. Portola was, in the Jesuit writings, is very favorably treated because all of the Jesuits who actually left Baja California arrived in Europe alive, and that was unusual. Right? He treated them very, very well. So Portola basically expels the Jesuits. He is there when Father Serra arrives. Serra is appointed. The Jesuit missions are given to the Franciscans. The headquarters of the Franciscans is the Colegio de San Fernando in Mexico City, to which Junípero Serra was a member. He is sent to Baja California as the head of the missions there. As we talked about last night, Serra is delighted with this because he's now getting a chance to do what he had come over from Mallorca to do 19 years ago, which was to convert native peoples. And he'd been in Mexico for 18 years and had never had the chance really to convert unbaptized native peoples. So he's delighted. Jose de Galvez, who is visitor general, comes over and tells Serra that Spain has decided to move farther north because they've gotten word that the Russians are moving across Siberia, can come down from, if they get to Alaska, they can come down the coast pretty quickly. And what we've got to do, we've got to occupy the two areas that earlier explorers have identified as good ports, San Diego and Monterey. Serra jumps at this opportunity. The expedition is under Portola's command. There are two boats that are sent out, and two land expeditions. The first land expedition is led by Fernando de Rivera y Moncada, and Juan Crespi, a former student of Serra's, is there as the diarist. And the second land expedition is led by Portola, and Serra is a member of that land expedition. They go up to Velicata, which is where Portola had decided that the second leg of the land expedition would have its staging ground. Serra founds a mission. He founds a mission in Baja California, names it San Fernando. And then as he is about ready to leave, to head up north, he has what is clearly, and we said this last night, but it bears repeating, the most emotional day of his entire life, May 15th, 1769.
And I hope you don't mind hearing about it one more time. Re-entry is always good. For me, it was a day of great consolation. Soon after the masses were said, while I was quiet with my thoughts in the small hut that was my dwelling place, they alerted me that the Gentiles were approaching and that they were close. I praised God, kissed the ground, and gave thanks to our Lord for granting me this opportunity to be among the Gentiles in their land, after longing for this for so many years. I saw what I could hardly believe when I would read about it or when I would be told about it, which was that the Gentiles were totally naked, like Adam in paradise before the fall. That is how they went about, and that is how they presented themselves to us. We interacted with them for quite some time, and not once did they show any sign of embarrassment, seeing that we were clothed and they were not. I placed my hands on the head of each Gentile, one at a time, as a sign of affection.
So we talked about last night Serra's journey from Loreto to San Diego. This is from his diary. Those of you who were here yesterday, this is his diary. Port of San Diego, thanks be to God. You can see how excited he is to actually be there, right? And there's a map of San Diego with the point there. This was drawn by Jose Pantoja in 1782. He was an engineer. who was served with the Spanish military. So they get to San Diego. Great. Now Portola is not really super excited to be in California. He wants to get back to civilization. So he quickly what he wants to do, okay, I've got half of my job done. I've got to San Diego. Now I've got to get to Monterey. And so within a couple of weeks after they all rendezvous in San Diego, Portola has organized a ground expedition to head north to find and establish a beachhead at Monterey itself. All right. Interestingly enough, this expedition, the Portola expedition, is often called the sacred expedition. Anybody ever heard that phrase? Right. This is actually from the Steinbeck Center in Salinas. They did an artistic representation of it. It's called the Sacred Expedition because the missionaries are regarded as the major people in the expedition. But actually, there were 5 missionaries and about 40 soldiers in the expedition. And the object of the expedition was really to establish a Spanish military presence in San Diego and in Monterey to prevent the Russians. If the Russians showed up, they could be kind of shooed away by the forts. And so the first thing that they did when they got to San Diego was they established a presidio, a fort. And this is northern New Spain, now northern Mexico. And you can see the number of presidios and towns that were there. We tend to think that the missions were, the major instrument of Spanish expansion, and they were obviously very, very important. But they were only one of a triad. And the other 2 legs of the triad, the presidio and the pueblo, were very, very important. Then in the early days, the presidio was in many ways much more important than the mission. And so what Portola does before he leaves for Monterey is he establishes a presidio, a military base in San Diego. When he goes up to Monterey, he leaves 8 soldiers there with Sarah. But he wants to get up to Monterey, fulfill the rest of my orders, and go back to civilization, go back to Mexico City. Right? And so what Portola does is he takes his soldiers up and they head up. They go up along the coast, up to the LA Basin. They continue pretty much along the coast until they get to Morro Bay. And if you know what Morro Bay, if you've ever been on Highway 1, you can't go along the coast anymore. So they go inland. They see the Salinas River. They say, aha, river, that goes to the ocean. So they follow the Salinas River. And it comes out in Monterey Bay. It comes out at a place called Bueno, which is about 2/3 of the way down Monterey Bay between Santa Cruz and Monterey. So they get to Monterey, they look around, and they don't recognize it from the descriptions that other explorers had given. So they figure, well, Monterey, it's got to be somewhere. So they keep going north. They finally get up to where Pacifica is. Right? And by this time, Portola is thinking we've probably gone too far. And so what he does is he sends some soldiers under the leadership of a sergeant, Jose Francisco de Ortega, up to the mountains to kind of scope things out. Ortega gets to a place called Sweeney Ridge, looks out and sees 2 things which immediately tell him they've gone too far. He sees Point Reyes and he sees the Farallon Islands. And he knows that they've gone too far north. And then he turns around and looks in the other direction and becomes the first European to see what he can't believe, the largest inland body of water that he has ever seen, San Francisco Bay. And so what they do after accidentally discovering San Francisco Bay, Portola goes down. They march down the western shore of the bay. They go up the eastern part to about Hayward or so, turn around, and then go back to Monterey, have a council. They're at the Point of Pines, which is right there in Monterey, but they don't recognize it. And then they say, okay, we can't find it. So they go back to San Diego. All right. When they get back in January, Portola tells Sarah that they couldn't find Monterey, and Sarah said, well, that's like going to Rome and not seeing the Pope, for crying out loud. But in the spring, another expedition, this time a sea expedition and a land expedition go up, and they do discover Monterey, and they do found a presidio in Monterey in June of 1770. And this is what the presidio kind of looked at about 1773 or so. This was a plan that was drawn up under the leadership of military commander Pedro Fages. And you can see that the presidio is basically a fort. And you've got four corners here where there were probably cannon, if there were cannons on each side. There was a whole bunch of different kinds of things, warehouses. There was a presidio chapel right there. There was, it says Iglesia Actual and Iglesia Nuevo. All right, so that's the Presidio Chapel. Ruben Mendoza, who will be here in a month or so, has done a lot of archaeology at the Presidio Chapel. So it was a fairly elaborate kind of thing. And this is the Presidio as it looked in 1925. 1825 by William Smythe, and as it looked a couple of years later with the Beachy expedition. Right? And it kind of was Monterey was the capital of Spanish California, and later on becomes the capital of Mexican California. Sarah founds the chapel, which is going to turn into a mission, right next to the Presidio. But as we talked about last night, he's very, very unhappy with this location. And this is how he explains his unhappiness.
There is no Indian village at all in the vicinity of this port. Because of this, if we see that the Indians are determined to accept our holy faith, we need to recognize the special difficulty they will have in taking up residence here. It might be necessary to leave the Presidio and with a few soldiers of the escort, move the mission close to the Carmel River, 2 short leagues to the south. It is a truly splendid location, capable of producing abundant crops because of the plentiful and excellent land and water.
When we give this presentation in Northern California, we say, the Indians were living where any of us could live if we could afford it. They were living in the Carmel Valley.
Definitely.
So, as you know, as we talked about, Serra goes down to Mexico City. He dies in 1784. He's succeeded by Fermín Francisco de la Suen, who actually was one of the first people who founded San Juan Capistrano in 1775, but they had to abandon it after a couple of weeks because of the San Diego rebellion. So La Suen becomes the head of the missions. He's headquartered at Mission Carmel because Monterey is the capital, so it makes sense that the head missionary will be at the closest mission to Monterey, which is in Carmel. And La Suen is there in Monterey.
But there are other things going on, and you'll see that I love the pictorial record. I think it's so beautiful. Until the 18th century, knowledge of the Northern Pacific was limited to the coast of California. Starting in 1774, Spain responded to the growing threat of Russian settlements in America, as well as English and French expeditions, by launching an unprecedented campaign for the exploration of the Pacific Northwest. In 1789, the Spanish crown put this gentleman, Alejandro Malaspina, who was an Italian-born commander in the Spanish Navy and also an explorer and scientist, they put him in charge of a scientific exploration of the Pacific. His 2 vessels left Spain in July 1789, and there were many scientists and 2 artists on the expedition. The ships reached Acapulco early in 1791, and during the early summer of that year, they sailed north to explore the coasts of British Columbia and Alaska, returning southward at the end of July. They stopped at Spanish headquarters on Nootka Island on August 12, 1791, and at Monterey in California on September 12, 1791. The artists and the scientists who accompanied the expedition created an enormous wealth of scientific information, ranging from botanical catalogs and prints to ethnographic drawings and accounts and very accurate coastal surveys. Now, Malaspina's vessels left Monterey and headed for the Philippines, New Zealand, the British colony at Sydney Cove in Australia, and the Tonga Islands. The expedition circled the globe before reaching Spain again in 1794. Now, after his famous voyage, Malaspina's outspoken criticism of Spanish colonial policies in America caused him to fall out of favor with the Spanish crown, and he was imprisoned. And all accounts of the expedition were suppressed until decades later.
See, this is a good example of what we were talking about right at the beginning, the Indian agency, the Indian voice. This is pictures that Jose Cordero, who was one of the artists on the Malaspina expedition, drew. And this is the final spot here. So you see that the Indian woman is kind of with these characters back here, you know, kind of in a very, very classical sort of thing, you know. But this is Cordero's first draft. So this is probably what she looked like on the left. And you can see the differences. Here she's smiling. There's not a happy camper right here. Her basket is open. It's closed. You know, she's much more inviting. She's much more welcoming in the final picture than she probably was in real life. And if you kind of put stuff like this together, you can see that this woman is probably in this, as she actually was, expressing a certain kind of resentment at being made to pose. But here she is presented in a way that is going to be attractive to Europeans. They, the native peoples of California, are welcoming our presence.
Well, and the same with the next one. You might point out the stance of this man. He looks almost like a Greek god, the way he's standing, posing for the drawing. And you get a sense of the huts and then the other children or young people down there. Here's this quiver, and this you'll see images of quiver by Chori and other artists. So this is something prevalent in artistic representations. And we showed you this yesterday, but these are drawings of a Monterey soldier and his wife, and very representative of the outfits that they would wear. I love the butterflies. We actually, when we went to Spain to do research on our book, Lands of Promise and Despair, we actually got to hold these images. And I was so freaked out because I thought, shouldn't we be putting on gloves and everything? And no, that apparently is worse. You shouldn't be using gloves. But they brought all these things out for us to look at, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm touching the Malaspina drawings. They're gorgeous. This one, oxalis. How many of us go to Home Depot and get the weed killer to get rid of this? Next time you kill oxalis in your yard, remember this painting. And the birds, the seagulls, again, the pansy, woodpecker, the quail. It's so cool. In your backyard. This guy, I love this raccoon. He's like, arr. When we've shown this to young students, they just go wild over this guy. Whoops, sorry about that. Whoops. The cactus, which you can find at Safeway at Christmas time. The badger, dove. Why is this jumping? Coyote, crab. We used this for a place card once. We had a dinner, and anybody who wanted salmon, this was their place card. See, these images you can use. And this guy is my favorite, the squirrel. Okay.
So, when the Malaspina expedition comes in the 1790s, the mission and presidio system is in an expansive kind of mode. During the 1790s, 5 missions are started very, very quickly. There are 4 presidios in California: San Francisco, which was founded in 1776, Monterey and San Diego, which had been founded right at the beginning, and the final presidio was in Santa Barbara, which was founded in 1782. They're founded in the midst of what was probably the most densely occupied area of North America. conservative estimates are that in 1769, from San Diego to what is now the northern border of the state of California, over to the east to what's now the eastern border of the state of California, there were about 310,000 people living here, right? The Spanish, basically, you can see, they basically go along the coast, and they get up to Sonoma. This whole area, the inland, the Central Valley, and the north is basically, by and large, untouched by Spanish presence. Now, that doesn't mean that they were unaffected by Spanish presence. There were diseases that came. Some of them came from the missions, but most of the diseases that came from into the Central Valley were introduced by fur trappers from Canada or from the Rocky Mountain areas. By the 1820s, the fur frontier from the United States was in the Rocky Mountain areas. And in 1829, Jedediah Smith kind of makes a big famous incursion into some areas of California. This is one of the first maps of the San Francisco Bay Area. It was drawn by Pedro Font, who was a Franciscan who was the diarist of the Anza expedition of 1776. And you can see this is the Santa Clara Valley here, which is called the Llano de los Robles, the oak plain of the oak trees. And there you see San Francisco Bay and the inland valley, the Tulares, Monterey, the Point of Pines down there, Año Nuevo Point right there. It's fairly accurate a map that Font was able to do. But the important thing to understand, this is the Bay Area. Most California native peoples lived in groups of about a couple hundred people or so. These people are all part of what is called the Ohlone Indian group, but it's a large constellation of different subgroups. And even the subgroups have different kinds of subgroups. Most people lived in what anthropologists used to call tribelets, smaller tribes, and they tended to kind of have an area of their own, but within that area they would have multiple locations depending on the seasons, depending upon the availability of game, and upon the availability of crops that they could gather. There were expeditions that were a constant feature of the Spanish presence. These are expeditions in the Bay Area, coming generally from Monterey. Expeditions were going out to the East Bay, around to founding San Francisco and Santa Clara. A number of expeditions did go into the Central Valley. Not too many, but there were a few. The more elaborate missionary plans sometimes involve setting up a chain of missions in the Central Valley to kind of complement the chain of missions along the coast. But the problem with the missionaries was the same problem that Spain had. Back then, I tell my students this when I teach California history, back then, California was the end of the world. Nobody wanted to come here. Why would you want to come here? If you could, the largest city in the New World was Mexico City. It was the metropolis. If you lived in Mexico City, why would you want to go out to the middle of nowhere, which was basically what California was? And so the Franciscans consistently had problems getting enough missionaries to staff the missions along the coast. And here's the mission chain along the coast. Spain had tremendous problem getting people to come up to California. There was the Portola expedition. Fernando de Rivera y Moncada brought up some people from Sonora in 1774. Rivera brought some other people up in 1781. Anza brought some people up in 1776. And that was about it. That was about it. There were not very many people who were willing to come up to California. Serra, as I indicated last night, spent the last half of his time in California fighting with Felipe de Neve, who was the governor. And what Neve wanted to do was Neve wanted to weaken, Neve was a Bourbon loyalist, and he wanted to weaken the power of the church in California. And so what he wanted to do was set up a series of competing localities against the missions. And these were the pueblos. And what Neve does in 1777, he establishes the pueblo of San Jose. And the pueblo was basically modeled after a Spanish town. So there's a central plaza, which has the church, which has some kind of government official, and people generally lived around the central area. And then they farmed their lands, which were given to them, which were distributed by the military. They farmed their lands, which were outside of the pueblo. So San Jose was founded in 1777 over Serra's virulent objections. And in 1781, Neve founded the Pueblo of Los Angeles over Serra's even stronger objections. The job of the Pueblos was basically to try to give the presidios enough food so that the presidios would not have to rely on the missions. If you think of the location, San Jose is roughly halfway between San Francisco and Monterey. Los Angeles is roughly halfway between San Diego and Santa Barbara. So the pueblos were put between the existing presidios so that they could function as food supplies for the presidios, and the presidios would not have to rely upon the agricultural output of the missions for their food. So the pueblos were meant to weaken the power of the missions. And that's why Junipero Serra and a number of the other missionaries never really liked them at all. These are some pictures that we have from by Luis Chori, who was the same person who drew the picture right at the beginning. These are some Indians, some Cholvan Indians in San Francisco Bay. Cholvan Indians are hunting on the shores of San Francisco Bay. These people are people, Mission San Jose, which is in Fremont, was placed out in the hills to try to kind of attract people from the Central Valley to come into the mission system. In San Francisco Bay, the Mission San Francisco, and then in 1817, Mission San Rafael were placed there to try to attract people from the northern part of the San Francisco settlements. And these are some pictures that Chori drew of some of the native peoples of San Francisco, of the San Francisco Bay Area in 1816. So they're people from the Huichun group and the Saklan group, which were, again, subgroups of the Ohlone people. So even during this whole time of the expansion of the Spanish colonial system with missions and pueblos and presidios, native peoples really were the people who continued to be in the forefront. And this very famous picture of San Gabriel, it's a very famous picture done by Ferdinand Deppe in 1832, but look what's in the foreground. Indigenous native housing. So the native peoples remain constant.
Well, we're going to show you two images of the Stations of the Cross that are at Mission San Fernando. The indigenous artist, Juan Antonio, may have been one of several painters of the Stations of the Cross. If you look at number 6 here, carefully, number 7, carefully, you can see the obvious negative feeling that the artist had for Christ's tormentors. It seems that he turned some of Christ's Roman persecutors into Spaniards. So several of the soldiers with huge, kind of unintelligent eyes and sinister, grotesque expressions are dressed like Spaniards. Spanish robes and Spanish hats adorn the figures shown as persecutors of Christ.
Veronica is wiping the face of Jesus in the 6th Station of the Cross, as you know. Veronica is dressed like an Indian woman, and that's really, really important. So we actually know Norman Nuremberg, who was a great art historian of California, thinks he knew what the model that this guy was working off of was. And you can look at the model and you can see the way in which the native artist kind of changed the model to kind of express their own feeling that the Spanish soldiers are like the people who persecuted Jesus. And the people who helped Jesus are like us. So they're identifying the indigenous artist, about whom we know very little, but his name seems to have been Juan Antonio, is really taking a stance towards this. And this is really important because, we don't know very much about him. Most of what we know from Spanish and later on Mexican California comes from official records, And official records were written by priests who were well educated and soldiers, military officers who were also generally tended to be decently educated, right? And they are a very, very small segment of society. And yet the people like Juan Antonio, the kind of the regular people, constitute the majority of that society as they constitute the majority of any society. And yet we do know something about their experience in Spanish and Mexican California, largely because of the work of this man, Hubert Howe Bancroft. He was actually, he was a bookseller in Gold Rush, San Francisco. He came from the East, sold books in Gold Rush, San Francisco. And gradually in the 1850s and 1860s, kind of got into his head that he wanted to write a history of the West and a history of California. And Bancroft basically set up his own study area here. This is his study in his home in San Francisco. And he set up his own company. And there's the Bancroft building, which was on Market Street, 721 Market Street in downtown San Francisco. Actually, once when Rosemary and I were going to give a talk at the California Historical Society, which is a couple of blocks away from here, we decided, hey, we had a little bit of time. Let's see what is at 721 Market Street now and what's there.
Any ideas? Super duper burgers. Bancroft is probably turning over in his grave.
But Bancroft, to his credit, and this is in the 1870s, okay, but Bancroft, to his credit, and he was very different than other American historians of early California, did not think that California history began with the gold rush. That all the important stuff in California history happened after 1848. No, Bancroft, when he wanted to write his history of California, wanted to try to interview people who had lived in California before the gold rush. And so we hired a couple of people, Spanish speakers. One was a man from Italy named Enrique Cerruti, to go out and try to interview some people who had lived in California before the gold rush. And in those interviews of these people, we can really get a sense of what daily life was like in California.
This slide is really near and dear to my heart. I taught a class on the 19th century novel in Spain, the Spanish realist novel, just this winter quarter. And my students read La Gaviota by Fernán Caballero. Fernán Caballero is a pseudonym for Cecilia Bol de Faber, a woman. She had to use a man's name to get her novel published. So my students were just all, upset. But this comes from part 2, chapter 4. La vida de un hombre es siempre historia, pero la vida de una mujer es siempre una novela. So I have the translation, a man's life is always history, but a woman's life is always a novel. I don't think so, okay? In 19th century America, men were usually regarded as the true makers of history. This view was even more pronounced in the male-dominated society that Gold Rush California had produced. A total of 78 people were interviewed by Hubert Howe Bancroft's staff for his project of writing the 7-volume history of California. But of those 78 people, 13 were women, and the interviews with the women were often an afterthought. But it's really lucky that we have these interviews of these 13 women because they have important insights, important perspectives into the development of their native land. They had lived through the gold rush, and they had seen their country change so drastically since the days of Spanish and Mexican rule. These women understood how important it was to tell the full story of the people and the places that made up their California. These women's lives were not a novel, but rather complex histories through which we garner a deeper appreciation of the range of personalities and experiences that have helped to create the world that we inhabit. Now here we have a woman by the name of Isidora Filomena. And
Cerruti actually interviewed her in Sonoma in 1874. An interesting interview, an important one, the first woman who was interviewed by Bancroft's staff, and very, very significant because she was not a Mexican. She was not a Spaniard.
on April 4th, 1874, Cerruti went to Lacrima Montis, which is Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo's home in Sonoma. He went there to interview Isidora Filomena, who was the widow of Vallejo's important Indian ally during the 1830s and 1840s. His name was Sem Yeto, but he was better known among the Mexicans as Chief Francisco Solano, Chief Solano. Now, Isidora was living close to Lacrima Montis in a small house that had been loaned to her by Vallejo in return for the assistance of Chief Solano. One thing that I find really, really fascinating about this testimonio is that it is the only one that we have from an indigenous woman. The language in which it is taken down replicates her speech. Her native language was not Spanish, but she spoke to Cerruti in Spanish. And there are verbs that are not conjugated. You can tell that it wasn't her native tongue. So as a Spanish teacher, it was fascinating from a linguistic standpoint. But it was so noble from a human standpoint that she really wanted to talk about her people, and she was willing to do it in a language in which she was not that comfortable. Now, Cerruti's opinion of Isidora versus what comes through the text is really interesting. Cerruti is rather condescending, but she maintains her spirit, her dignity, her strength, and she starts out by saying, "My name is Isidora. I am 90 years old. The Indians who knew me when I was the wife of Chief Solano called me princess, and they still treat me like a princess. And even some of the white men who from time to time come to Lacrima Montis to visit us still call me princess." Now, Isidora was Chief Solano's third wife. She says, "I belonged to Solano before I married him and even before I was baptized. I am not a Susun like he is. I belong to the Chiruk tribe. My father's tribe lived near Cache Creek." Now, you think of Cache Creek as the casino. You probably hear about that. But that's where they were from. She didn't say the casino. "I do not know the name of the county to which it belongs today. On a trip Solano took there to do some negotiating, he stole me. My father and many Satiyomi went after him, but they could not catch him." What is so incredibly fascinating about her testimonial is that she exhibits such pride in her culture. She talks about her people. She gives specific details about their everyday life. She tells us what they looked like, how tall they were, and she says that the men got gray hair, but the women didn't, which is fascinating little details. And she says we had a numerical system. So she even gives that to Cerruti. And contrary to the stereotype held by many that the indigenous people were not clean, Isidora said that the Indians were very clean. She describes the soap root bulb that they used. She says, and it sounds almost like a commercial, "It removes all stains and does not burn your body or make your skin hurt. We like to bathe very much because cleanliness makes you strong. My people had white teeth, which they cleaned with a stick called fresno." Fresno is the ash tree. So when you give information like this to students coming through on the tours, they're fascinated by it. These people were clean.
Another person that Bancroft hired was a man named Thomas Savage, who had been born in Havana because his father was in the U.S. diplomatic service and was the consul in Havana. So Savage knew Spanish. And in 1877, he took a trip down to Southern California, Savage did, to interview people and try to collect documents and things like that. And so one of the people that he interviewed was a woman named
Eulalia Perez. I love her. She is my heroine. She is a woman whose life was no way near being a novel. She made history. She is a woman whose contributions to society demonstrated that she was a woman of many identities. She was a mestiza, a wife, a mother, a midwife, a cook, a supervisor, a seamstress, and a teacher, and she was strong. She was born in Loreto in the late 1770s. Some people think that she was born in 1768, which would have made her 110 years old when Savage interviewed her in December 1877. She was not 110. Eulalia Perez insisted that her parents, Diego Perez and Rosalia Cota, were white people through and through. It was really important for her to be seen as a Spanish person because of the racism that existed. But many scholars say that the soldiers from Sonora and Sinaloa were mestizo. She married Miguel Antonio Guillen, who was a Presidio soldier at Loreto, and she was only 15 years old when she got married. She had 3 sons and 1 daughter while there in Loreto. 2 of the boys died, but Isidoro, who was born in 1791, and Petra, who was also born in 1791, were with Eulalia and Guillen when they moved to San Diego in 1802. The family lived at the Presidio in San Diego until 1810, and Guillen continued as a Presidio soldier. You've seen this before, but it bears repeating. Eulalia and her husband were attired in a similar fashion when they were stationed at the Presidio in San Diego. Now, Eulalia Perez's skills as a midwife were in demand at the Presidio. She was the only woman at that time at the Presidio who knew how to deliver babies. And she says that she was truly appreciated by the families of San Diego, who treated her and her children really well. They even provided for them at times. Eulalia traveled frequently from San Diego to San Gabriel to assist women in labor. That's a long trip, even in the car today. Now, she recalled that in 1801, she was the midwife who helped in the delivery of Pio Pico. In 1810, she and her family moved from San Diego to Mission San Gabriel, where her husband served in the Mission Guard, or the Escolta. You know this place very well. You walk by it every time you're here. Eulalia Perez was here the day of the 1812 earthquake. She was pregnant at the time, and she tells how people were so scared that they knocked her down, they were walking on top of her, and she barely got out alive. She immediately returned to San Diego, and she says, kind of funny, she goes, "Soon after, I gave birth to my daughter, Maria de Los Angeles." It was pretty quick after I arrived in San Diego. I bet it was. Wow. Now, the women would recall events such as the earthquake in connection with what was happening in their own lives, in their family, and in society. Their recollection of events was not tied to the deeds of the military or to politics, like the men would describe. Their social universe was centered more around the family, women, children, and ordinary folks. The California that emerged from the testimonials of people like Eulalia Perez show us that this was a frontier, that this was a really complicated place in which the familial intersected with the political and in which the public sphere interacted with the private sphere to create a different kind of society than the one that the Americans had brought. Now, in 1814, they went back to San Diego. Her husband was ill, and he wanted to retire from the military. Around 1815, they came back to San Gabriel, and her husband died soon after in Los Angeles. Now that she was a widow, she had to find a way to support her family. Moving back and forth from San Gabriel to San Diego really put a strain on them. Now, knowing that she had a unique and indispensable talent as a midwife, and that she had earned the respect of the military in San Diego because of this skill, she decided to move back to San Diego, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. She and her family lived with Presidio Commander Santiago Arguello and his family. I love this woman so much because her mentality reminds me very much of how my own grandmother used to think. My grandmother was born in Cuba, didn't speak much English, but she'd always say to me, "Yo me puedo defender," which would mean, I can take care of myself. And that's what Eulalia Perez did. Ella podía defenderse y lo hizo. I love this woman. Now, in 1821, her services were in demand at Mission San Gabriel. The father there, Jose Sanchez, wrote to his cousin, Father Fernando, at Mission San Diego, requesting that he speak with the Presidio commander to allow Eulalia's son to bring her and the whole family back to San Gabriel. So now we have the missionaries and the military vying for Eulalia Perez's services. How cool is that? Father Sanchez promised to provide her and her family with a small house until she could find work. And Isidoro served in the mission guard, so they all moved back to San Gabriel, and she's going to stay there. Midwifery was not her only skill. She also was an excellent cook and had what I would say today people would call really good people skills. She proved to be an excellent supervisor. She recounts that there were 2 women in the area who were experienced cooks, and they would be called upon to come and prepare meals on important feast days at the mission. Now, one of the women, Maria Luisa Cota, was the wife of the mayordomo at Mission San Gabriel. Eulalia says the priests were looking for a way to help her, support her family, and they were trying to give her enough work, but they didn't want to upset the other women. So, at that time, the mission was in need of an experienced cook who could teach the Indians how to cook. So the priests decided to hold a cook-off, kind of like a Pillsbury baking competition. And they encouraged her to be one of the contestants. The 2 expert cooks and Eulalia would cook for a panel of 8 male judges on a designated day. One of the judges was Jose Antonio Pico, Pio Pico's brother. And the other judge, get this, was Claudio Lopez, the husband of Maria Luisa Cota, the wife of the mission mayordomo. Well, Eulalia won the contest. I would not have wanted to be at the mission with Maria Luisa Cota and Claudio Lopez, the mayordomo. You let her win? I'm your wife. How come I didn't win? I bet that happened. I really do. I bet that happened. Oh my God, you can just hear the bzz buzzing. Well, being an expert cook was fabulous, but this was just the beginning of her important career at Mission San Gabriel. Eulalia Perez was a woman whose contributions to society demonstrated that she was a woman of many talents, as I said at the beginning. Mestiza, wife, mother, midwife, cook, supervisor, seamstress, teacher, also dancer and singer. She apparently was one of the best dancers in Alta California, winning dancing contests. But there is more. She was a celebrity. Eulalia Perez was somewhat of a tourist attraction in Southern California. Local boosters were touting her advanced age, get this, as evidence that living in Southern California, where the climate was great and the air was clean, that was good for your health. Okay, in June 1876, her daughter, Maria Antonia, contracted to have Eulalia Perez exhibited in San Francisco and at the Centennial Expo in Philadelphia as, quote, the oldest woman in the world. Really. The daughter received $5,000 for a 6-week tour. I know. Now, another daughter, Maria del Rosario, helped put a stop to this by catching up with Eulalia and her sister in Los Angeles. Get this, they were already headed on the way to San Francisco to be exhibited. Okay.
Another person, the final person we'll talk about, who was interviewed, was actually somebody who was from Southern California, but was interviewed outside of Monterrey, Teresa de la Guerra. She was the daughter of Jose de la Guerra y Noriega, the comandante of the Presidio in Santa Barbara. She grew up in the De la Guerra house and everything like that. She married William Edward Petty Hartnell, an Englishman who had come to California in the 1820s as an agent of a company to basically contract hide and tallows with trade with the mission. Well, in the 1830s, they end up in Monterey, and Hartnell actually starts a school.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about a visitor before I tell you about the school. In 1839, a French attaché arrived in Mexico. His name was Eugene Duflo de Mofras. You may have heard of him. And he spent time in Mexico, and then he came up to Alta California and spent 5 months here, from 1841 to 1842. Well, Duflo de Mofras happened to pass by Rancho Alisal, which was the home of Teresa and her husband. So he comes to the door, knocks at the door of the rancho. She opens the door. He said, "Oh, your husband told me that I could stop here and visit, maybe stay for a while." Well, the Californios were always very hospitable. That comes across in their documents. And she figured, well, if my husband said it's okay, then fine, he can stay. Well, this guy, Mr. Civilized, Mr. Great Manners, the Frenchman, goes into the library, and he starts going through the papers on her husband's desk, looking at everything, and she's standing there like, what? She said, it's not a crime to do that, but it's not very good manners. But she figured, okay, whatever. She then invites him to come and have dinner with them. So he goes into the comedor, into the dining room, and he sits at the head of the table. Good manners? And then they start bringing the food out, and he starts saying, "Oh, no me gusta, I don't like this. But no, I don't like this at all. It's not very good." And she's sort of taken aback, and she says, and she motions with her hand, "Well, this is the food that we eat in my home, and if you don't like it," I think she was going like this to the door, "you can leave." Well, he didn't leave. He didn't get the hint. He knew he had a good thing there. So he spends the night. The next morning, they go knock on the door. One of the servants goes and knocks on the door. Nobody answers the door, so they have to open it. There is Duflo de Mofras on the ground, stinking drunk. He had passed out. And she says, the odor in the room was not like the perfume of jasmine and roses. That was her description. What happened? In that room, they kept a lot of really good altar wine that her father would send from Santa Barbara, because they had a small chapel there to celebrate Mass. So she says, being a good Frenchman, he smelled it out. He knew the good wine. Anyway, he eventually leaves after having stolen some clothing from a trunk. I mean, this guy, the Frenchman who was civilized, didn't act in a civilized manner. Now, we believe that she told this story to her interviewer because she wanted to dispel the notion that people had that the Californios lived in the woods, that they were not cultured people, that they were not educated people. They were educated people. And the word una persona educada in Spanish, that means a person who has good manners. We're not necessarily talking book learning, but we're talking about someone who knows how to behave. He didn't. Well, this picture is really important because this is where Teresa and her husband had a school. In 1834, Governor Figueroa granted William Hartnell the land he was working at Alisal in exchange for his opening and administering a school on that land. The school was operated as a boarding school, and Teresa was in charge of taking care of all the students, up to 10 at that time, along with all 8 of her own kids. Now, ever since the arrival of Governor Solá, a man who strongly believed in and promoted Enlightenment ideals and who pushed hard for the establishment of schools for boys and girls, we see through the government records and the memoirs of the Californios, such as Vallejo, that education was essential if Alta California were to develop and progress. They wanted schools for their children. But the problem then, as now, is, or was, funding. Funding for schools, funding for supplies, funding for the wages for teachers, and finding truly qualified teachers. Usually, a retired soldier would be the teacher, and this person would have a very basic, rudimentary education. We were privileged to have a fellowship at the Huntington Library 2 years ago, and I found the minutes where battery's running low. Oh well. We found the minutes from the ayuntamiento, from the city hall, and in those minutes, they had these entries saying, we need schools, we need a school for women, we need girls, need a school for boys, but where are we going to get the money? And there was one person at the Presidio in San Francisco who was willing to take the job, but it sounds like what happens at schools now and at colleges. He goes, well, I need moving expenses. I need a house. I have a family. Where am I going to live? So he didn't take the job. But really quickly, this school book composed by Jose Mariano Romero, I found in the Ayuntamiento minutes that this guy was kind of a renegade. He was very, very bright. He prepared various school books, very modern, progressive thinking in his pedagogy, but the parents were criticizing him. They didn't like the way he was teaching the students. So he decided he wasn't going to come to school anymore, or he'd come when he wanted to. So they were punishing him for not coming to school. That was pretty interesting. I don't think any of us would behave that way nowadays. Bob and I are working on translating and annotating Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo's 5-volume history of Alta California. And Vallejo is really, really concerned about education and culture. He feels that the Californios are given short shrift, but they were cultured people. He has this entry here about the first pianos to arrive in California. 3 pianos came to California. The first piano that arrived by ship in California was displayed or shown off at one of the dances organized by Thomas O. Larkin for Commander Thomas Ep Catesby Jones in 1843. Larkin had asked Abrego, the man who owned the piano, if he could borrow the piano so he could use it at the dance for Jones. Abrego's response to Larkin was, "You're more than welcome to borrow the piano, but what good is it going to do you since there's nobody here who knows how to play it?" Well, okay. Well, it turns out that there was a young fellow named Pedro Estrada, and he overheard the conversation. So this fellow had an amazing gift for music, and he asked Abrego if he could have an audition and show him what he knew. So it turned out that this fellow knew how to play by ear. He played incredibly well, and Larkin was totally astonished by the young man's talent. That very night, Larkin went to speak with Governor Alvarado, and he suggested that the young Pedro Estrada be sent to Mexico City, where he could be formally trained in music, and the local government should pay the expenses. So the governor thought this was a fantastic idea, but there was one delegate, David Spence, who derailed the plan. Spence felt strongly that a good carpenter was worth much more to society than a music professor. Doesn't this sound like what's happening in schools today? Cutting the arts, everything is STEM, 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 but no art, music, etc. So what goes around comes around.
Mexico receives its independence from Spain in 1821, and by the 1830s, the Mexican government is determined to end the mission system. The mission system was only supposed to be temporary, but the Mexican government decided to end it, and they introduced a process called the secularization of the missions. Most of what we know from this is from the manuscript of Antonio Maria Osia, who wrote the first history of Alta California, which we had the privilege to translate and edit. Osia himself was a rancher and a customs collector. What happened was that under the mission system, the land was supposed to go to the Indians. What actually occurred was that the land went to the local California elite. Over the next 20 years, roughly 700 land grants were given. Only a handful were given to native peoples. Most of the land, this is actually from Santa Clara County, and when I teach California history, I tell my students, because we have a mission church on campus, so I say, go up to the top of the highest building on campus, which is the dorm, Swig Hall. Look around, and everything that you can see was part of Mission Santa Clara. Don't think of the mission as the church. The mission was thousands of acres of land. And over time, very quickly, what happens is that the mission lands are divided into various ranchos. This is a diseño, a map of one such rancho in San Leandro, which is in the East Bay, and you can see the way in which the land, the ranchos were described. So this one went from Mission, this is Mission San Jose, to the mountains, down to the house here, the Estudillo house, and the Mar, the bay. This is the San Francisco Bay. Everybody kind of knew where the ranchos were. They were from this tree to that mountain to this stream, But this was going to be a problem when the Americans come in, because the Americans want latitude and longitude. And they're going to want documents describing latitude and longitude and that kind of thing. And the Californios can't provide them. So the ranchos are a huge number. This is Rancho El Rincon, Santa Barbara. You can see the mountains there. This is where Rincon State Beach is, between Ventura and Santa Barbara. Some of you have probably driven by there on Highway 101. This is Rancho de Tierra Azusa. You probably know where that is. It's now the Azusa. This is the Rio de Azusa. It's the Azusa River Wilderness Park is in this area right now. And here's the diseño of a bunch of parajes, Santa Gertrudis, Coyotes, Bolsas, Alamitos, Sierritos. This is Rio Santa Ana, the Santa Ana River, and this is Rio San Gabriel, the San Gabriel River. So this is basically in Southern California. This is the ocean. Huntington Beach is probably right about there. Okay. So but basically, you had about 700 ranchos. The ranchos during this time were basically, this is another one in Monterey County, but there's this Antonio Maria Ocio's signature, which we like. The ranchos were very, very active places. This is the Jimeno Rancho outside of Monterey, and you can see they're active kind of places. The Indians a lot of times turn out to be the vaqueros, the cowboys, or the ranch hands at the various ranchos. The ranchos raised basically one thing. They raised cattle, not to eat, but to sell. The hides and the tallows. The hides end up basically in the east coast of the United States, where they become, the cattle hides of California become the raw materials for one of the first American industries, shoemaking in Massachusetts. The tallow, the fat, generally is turned into soap and candles in California, and the surplus tallow tended to be exported to the Sandwich Islands or Hawaii. Right? This picture tells you, the romantic life, the romantic image of the California rancho, where you have everything with fandangos every night, the Ramona image that we talked about last night, wasn't true. This is a guy who lived outside of Fort Ross. But look at the way he's dressed. This was a rough and tumble frontier land. California was still the end of the world. There are some vaqueros lassoing a steer, done by a French artist in 1850. This is the matanza, the slaughter, done by William Rich Hutton. William Rich Hutton came to the Monterey area during the Mexican War and did a whole bunch of drawings and paintings, all of which are at the Huntington Library down in San Marino. And there you see the landscape after the hides and the tallows. And there is this next picture. Laborers who are obviously indigenous people.
Look at the faces.
Stirring the tallow pots, getting the tallow ready for processing. One of the most famous scenes of Rancho California happened right down the road here at Dana Point. It's a scene from 2 years before the Mass, where Richard Henry Dana describes the hides being wagoned in carretas like this to the cliff and then tossed down to the beach, right, where they were going to be shipped then away. The carreta was the basic transportation unit.
And Eulalia Perez, my girlfriend, she would only ride in carretas. She refused to ride in coaches because she said in a carreta she could stretch out. So I view the carreta not only as something that takes hide to the shore, but it was Eulalia's limo.
The native peoples who were unaffected by the Spanish and Mexican enterprise basically begin to be more affected by newcomers in the 1840s, when American wagon trains begin to come down from the Sierras. They really start in 1841, and every year from 1841 onward, more and more wagon trains branch off from the Oregon Trail and come down the California Trail down the Sierras. These are the people who begin to encroach upon the indigenous peoples north of the San Francisco Bay Area. There's an Indian village or rancheria, a hut from a vaquero, probably an indigenous vaquero in the same area. By this time, in the 1840s, Manifest Destiny is alive and thriving in the United States. And especially after the Texas Revolution of 1836, and then when Texas is admitted into the Union in 1844, and James Polk is elected president in the election of 1844, it's pretty clear that the United States has its eyes on California. In fact, the commander of the Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy had standing orders that in the event of war between the United States and Mexico, which everybody expected would happen, he should take California. And in 1842, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, Thomas Capsby Jones, erroneously heard when he was in Peru that war had broken out between the U.S. and Mexico, so he quickly sailed up and took Monterey. When he found out from the newspaper, this is done by William Myers, who was there at the time, when he found out that war, in fact, had not broken out, he gave Monterey back.
Yeah.
But war does break out in 1846. And quickly, the historians still argue what was the real aim of the Mexican War. Many historians believe that the real aim of the Mexican War was San Francisco, a Pacific port. Right? And quickly after the war breaks out, Commander Sloat takes Monterey and San Francisco within a couple of days in 1846. And the Americans, there are some battles in Southern California, in San Pascual. But in January of 1847, the California forces under Andres Pico, the brother of Pio Pico, surrender at Cahuenga to John C. Fremont. And I show my students when I teach the Mexican War, I show them the Cahuenga adobe where Pico surrendered to Fremont, and I tell them, what do you think is there now? What's around it? Any ideas? Universal, the Universal City is right there. So the Californios become, as one of them described, strangers in their own land. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican War, which is signed in February of 1848, guarantees land and political rights to the inhabitants of the territory that the United States is going to annex. In California, the land is generally not available to the Californios because in 1851, Congress passes a Land Act which basically makes the Californios prove, it assumes that the land grants were invalid, and makes the Californios provide the kind of documentation which the Anglo-American land system required, which basically the Californios did not have. Right? And so over time, what happens is that most California rancho families, they mortgage part of the ranch to try to get enough money to pay lawyers to try to save the rest. And then it becomes a vicious circle. And by about the 1870s, most Californios have lost most of their land. And that brings a new stage into the history of California. But that would take us much too far afield. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all very, very much. I hope we've given you an overview of California.
It was a long tour.